to welcome Professor John Weeks, who has been a long-standing friend of mine, a personal friend, as well as a colleague, a tutor. He is associated with our university for a very long time, now about 5 or 6 years. Apart from a couple of years he's been here giving lectures, he came to Kadir University. John Weeks studied at University of Texas. He completed his undergraduate years at University of Texas, Austin. And then his graduate school was Michigan. He studied with some prominent economists there. Then he worked at Vermont for some time before joining faculty at University of London. He worked at University of London, holding a variety of positions there. And he's retired, and now he's an emeritus professor of economics, again at University of London. He did a number of research for a variety of African countries, Asian countries, and Latin American countries. His recent book, Capital Exploitation and Crisis, was published by Routledge in 2011. And he's going to talk about a very topical subject, the global depression and the euro crisis. So we welcome Professor John Weeks and look forward to hearing what he's got to say. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here on a more regular basis. Now, as I said, I've been coming off and on, but now I'm a bit more formal, and I hope also the students in the class are pleased when I begin teaching tomorrow. You've probably all heard of the famous statement by Groucho Marx that he didn't want to be a member of any club that was willing to take him. I think it's sort of that category in the case of Turkey and the European Union. That would be unclear if that's exactly the club that you ought to be considering entering, and I'm going to discuss why today. I have I write some topical things on that I put up on my webpage, and about 2 weeks ago I did one on the Italian crisis, if you're interested, called Breaking News, the Working Class Calls the Italian Crisis, and which I'll be talking about. And also in this area I've been working on with some other people on a recovery program for the United Kingdom, which is our latest comment. And Sadat mentioned this book which has come out, and also I have soon in February will be Routledge will bring out macro book of mine, which is a second edition of a previous one, but considerably changed. Because this version includes open economy macroeconomics, which I shall be referring to a little bit of open economy macroeconomics today. Okay. Why was there a euro crisis? Well, there are basically two explanations. One is what I call the drunken sailor explanation. That is, the Greeks, the Italians, the Spanish, Portuguese, the Irish, and then fill in any other nationality that happens to have a debt crisis, that they are all a bunch of spendthrifts. You know, they have too much government expenditure and run huge deficits and run up debt. And our complementary to that is the feckless foreigners argument, and that is that the Germans work hard, they work long hours, they save their money, while the Italians, the same group, actually, Greeks, Italians, so on. I'm sure if you were in the European Union, you would too, that they're all lazy and they retire too early and they spend all their time sitting around in tavernas drinking tea or wine or some such thing. And the particularly vulgar expression that is quotation that inspired my article, that Italian workers have paid themselves more than their German equivalents over the past 10 years for doing less work, less productive. One of the most interesting things about that quotation is that this writer in the Guardian seems to have discovered a new form of economic organization where the workers pay themselves. I don't know of any other country where the workers pay themselves. Most countries, the employers pay the workers, but in Italy, the workers pay themselves. Okay, so is there any truth to these? I mean, Greece did have a large deficit, does have a large deficit. Italy has a large debt. Germany has workers of high productivity. Is there any truth to this? Answer is no. Both explanations are complete rubbish. And if we wanted to identify what the problem was, first of all, if it is true, then all of Europe except Germany would appear to be lazy. This is a picture of the relationship between the German current account surplus and the deficit of the what I call pigs: Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. 2000, 2010. Germany's current account surplus is the mirror image of all these deficits. And it's not just those weak economies. But I don't know.
You want to use this one, John?
Somehow, that's what I'm looking for. Okay. It's not just those, but you also include France. While the French deficit is not as serious, this is billions of U.S. dollars. France also is going in a deficit after being in surplus, and so it's basically Germany is the surplus country, and everyone else in the European Union is a deficit country. How do we explain that? How do we explain such is it really coincidental that every other country? No, of course it's not. That again. First problem is German mercantilism. It's a new form of mercantilism. Well, not a new form, but it's a less overt form of mercantilism. Traditionally, mercantilism took in the 18th century took the form of restrictions on imports and various forms of export subsidies and undervalued currencies. And this is what Adam Smith and Ricardo and others were attacking. But the German form it can't directly pursue, the German government can't directly pursue those policies because it's within the European Union, at least not within the European Union, and it is nominally committed to free trade. So the particular way that it is sought to successfully pursue mercantilist policies is by freezing real wages. In effect, German real wages have not changed since unification. Actually, very slight upward trend, but not much. As a result of that, as you can imagine, the output per worker has risen during that period, and so unit labor costs have declined. So actually the German wage compression has led to Germany becoming much more competitive in manufacturing. While in the other countries, for the most part, I'm not going to bore you with a lot of graphs showing wage movement, but the wages have generally risen in line with productivity. That has been the case in Italy, where unit labor costs have been pretty much, in real terms, have been pretty much constant through 2000, while Germany have been falling. All right, so the reason for the balance of payments deficits, balance of current account deficits of almost all the other Euro countries, certainly all the other big ones, is German mercantilism. However, before I move on to the second one about the European Central Bank, I should deal with those explanations. Isn't it the case that these are spendthrift governments? Sure, Germans have been compressing real wages, but that only made a basic problem worse. The basic problem was, for example, Greece was running a very large public sector deficit. Italy was running a large public sector deficit. Spain was running a large public sector deficit. Let's start with Spain, which is a country now facing, as a new government, right-wing government, very zealous to start making budget cuts. There are very good data sources across our country. There are two for the Euro countries. One is the OECD, which has the advantage of also including non-European Union countries, the United States, Canada, and even some developing countries, China, Brazil, Argentina, and of course the European Union itself, Eurostat. Okay, so if you go to Eurostat and they have a table that shows the deficits in different countries, you will discover that in 2007, Spain had one of the smallest public sector deficits in the European Union. It was well within the Maastricht criteria. Okay. And then, when the financial collapse came, 2008, Spanish companies, particularly Spanish property companies, but also those in the productive sectors, were carrying very large debts which they had contracted from French and German banks, particularly German banks, because the interest rate in Germany was lower than in Spain. This is one of the anomalies that I'll come back to when I talk about a dysfunctional European Central Bank. See, this would be unknown in the United States. I'm not holding up U.S. up as a great example, but a lot of people who talk about the European Union compared to the U.S. In the U.S., you couldn't have much different borrowing rates in California than you did in New York because you have an integrated financial system. You have a regular banking system which is regulated by a central body rather thoroughly, if not tightly, namely the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so the Spanish property companies were borrowing from Germany. Then when the crisis came, the property boom bubble burst. They could not service their debts. And the Spanish government came under great pressure from, you'll never guess who, to assume those debts primarily held by German banks. So the German government, but also the French government, put pressure on the Spanish to basically nationalize those debts. There was precedent for this, but never on the same scale. So all of a sudden, the Spanish government found itself with a huge debt, which it hadn't had before, and also running a deficit, partly due to the large debt servicing costs, but largely because of the recession itself. Just about every country in the European Union deficits went up as a result of the recession, because tax revenues fell. In Britain, in 2007, the public sector deficit was the overall deficit was 2.7% of GNP. 2 years later, it's almost 10%. Almost all of that can be explained by falling tax revenues and increased payments associated with unemployment and people being out of jobs who've gone off unemployment, lost their unemployment and so on. Well, tax welfare payments. Okay, so that's Spain. Not the result of the Spanish may be lazy for all I know, but that's not why they have a financial crisis. Italy. You know, the Italians, they retire too early, they don't work long enough, they pay themselves too much. Actually, if you look at the statistics go to Eurostat, and it has a section on the labor market, and you can find statistics on hours worked. For full-time employees, it's about between full-time and part-time employees. For full-time employees, the country in the European Union that has the longest working hours is Greece, actually, and Italy is considerably higher than Germany. Germany's working hours, average weekly working hours, are 35.7. This is in the private sector, and Italy's are 38. So it's not a question of how long you work, and it also doesn't appear, if you think that, I mean, in my view, the question of unit labor cost has two components. One is how much workers are paid, and the second is what happens to productivity. What happens to productivity is largely the responsibility of management, it seems to me. So if you want to compare about, whether or not the role of trade unions in this crisis, you discover that you can't explain it through wages being forced up. But I was talking specifically about the Italian situation. Pretty clear what's called the Italian crisis. Italy's had almost no growth since about 2000. In the late 1990s, Italy had a moderate fiscal deficit. It was judged with a little bit of creative accounting, you might say. It was within the rules of the European Union, but the overall deficit was about 4% of GNP or something like that. And it basically remained at that level in real terms. I mean, if you take, in real lira, for the next decade, but the economy grew very slowly. So if you have an economy that's partly a function of initial conditions, but to make it very, very simplistic, if you have an economy that's growing at 5%, and you have a budget deficit of 4% of GNP, your total debt is going to grow slower than GDP. So the GDP to debt ratio is going to rise. You're becoming less indebted by that measure. But it works the other way if you're growing slowly. If your growth rate is below 1%, a deficit, which for a rapidly growing country is of little importance, becomes an increasing burden because your debt is growing faster than the economy is growing. And that was basically Italy's problem. Why did Italy have near zero growth? I don't know. I can't explain that. Low investment, Other countries are booming, Italy wasn't, but the solution there lies not in austerity, but in trying to stimulate growth. Okay. In the case of Greece, the last one I'm going to any detail. True, Greece had a very large public sector deficit. It was misrepresented. There is no question about that. Though now it does appear that I just saw a paper, an article in the Financial Times yesterday that says that the current size of the deficit has been overestimated for political reasons. But I didn't go into detail about that. That will be interesting to watch and see. As some of you may know, it's very easy to misrepresent deficits, depending on what you include in the institutions of a particular country. If anyone's interested in the question and answer period, I can go into that. So depending on how you measure it, the U.S. deficit may be as high as 15% of GNP or as low as 5% of GNP, depending on what you include, Social Security contributions and other things. Okay. So does that mean it was the Greeks' fault? Well, there is a clear reason why the Greek government was running those deficits when the military dictatorship came to an end and the Social Democrats took over. That seems like quite a long time ago, but it's certainly within living memory. And an implicit, it might have been explicit, agreement was made that Social Democrats could implement their social programs, but they would not go after redistribution through the tax system. In other words, they wouldn't make the rich pay the taxes. And that is the essential problem in Greece. The very wealthy people avoid taxes in all countries, but they do it with much greater success in Greece, apparently, than other countries. Okay, so that's why we got a crisis. It's a combination of German mercantilism and and each country's particular deficit has a different but related explanation. Each country's public sector deficit has a different related explanation, which is, of course, linked to the trade deficit. When you have a trade deficit, you are going into debt unless you have capital flows to cover it. And the capital flows that were coming in most of these countries were borrowing through Eurobonds. Okay. Now, this is not while it's a serious problem, it's not one that was beyond solution. So I can remember quite clearly when the Greek crisis blew up in May of last year, and came at a politically very advantageous moment for right-wing parties throughout Europe. For example, in Britain, it became the excuse for the Conservative Party and the coalition it was in to completely shift their position. They run the election which was held on the 8th of May, 2010. At that time, their position was they were not going to make, they were only going to make minor cuts over the period of Parliament and not major cuts. Soon as the Greek crisis broke, they switched their position and said, if we don't start getting this deficit down through cuts, then we'll end up like the Greeks. We'll be facing default in our own financial markets and so on, which is ridiculous, and I can go into that in a few questions, but that would divert me slightly. What would the solution have been? Well, the solution have been, Greece is a small country. It's one of, you look at, it's the big countries in the European Union are well, in the Eurozone, of course, France, Germany, Spain, Italy. And Greece is a small player. The obvious way to solve the problem would have been for the European Central Bank to buy up the Greek debt. Just to buy it up. And then begin to have the political figures begin to discuss with the Greek government what it was going to do so it wouldn't get into that situation again, and on what terms it would begin to pay off the debt which it now owed to the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank, given its assets, buying up the Greek debt would have been a very minor matter. But that's not what happened, as we know, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that it's a problem of the bank itself. Strictly speaking, it is not allowed to be what's called a lender of last resort. Now, what that means, for those of you who are not completely familiar with the arcane intricacies of central banking, if a government wants to borrow, it can sell bonds in the open market. So the banks, corporations, speculators, retirement funds can buy these bonds. However, if the government chooses not to do it that way, there's another way it can do it in most countries. For example, the United States or in Britain. And that is, it can sell its bonds to the central bank. So the central bank buys your bonds, and that is called, in the jargon, monetizing the deficit. And the reason it's called that is, if you sell your bonds to the public, you have no impact on the money supply. But you sell a bond for 100 lira, you get 100 lira. The government gets 100 lira from selling it to, say, a private pension fund. Then it spends it. It goes back in the government. There's no impact on the money supply. When you sell it to the central bank, in effect creates new money. So it's called monetizing the deficit. There might be good reasons to do that. For example, now, when the economy is depressed, you want to have a combined, well, you should want to have a combined fiscal expansion and monetary expansion. So you sort of give that a double boost. And so you go through the central bank. But another reason, the reason why it's important now in Europe is, say, Italy, as you may know, last week sought to borrow in private markets and discovered that it was going to have to pay in excess of 7% interest on those, what it was going to borrow. Getting up towards 7.5, I think it was got to 7.4 and then dropped down slightly. I mean, reflect on that for a moment. No government borrowing. It's hard to imagine any circumstances under which borrowing at over 7% is sustainable, because you can't grow fast enough to run ahead of your debt obligations. You're going to be paying 7% on what you borrow. And if you don't grow at that rate, it means that your interest payments are going to rise and rise and rise as a portion of your total payments. Okay, so how does the central bank come into this? The European Central Bank says, we will buy your Italian bonds at 5%, as much as you want to sell. Now, you say, well, what if the Italians go, they spin like drunken sailors? I'll come back to that point. Then you say, well, we're buying 5%. Then you don't have to worry about the interest rate going above 5%. Because it can't be bid above that. You've got lender of last resort, which is prepared to buy your bonds at put a ceiling on the lending rate. Actually, the European Central Bank has been doing that, but it has been doing it through certain another word in English, I'm not sure, more covert methods. So it's what it needs is a mandate to be able to do that as a matter of rational policy. And that's what Chancellor Merkel has repeatedly refused to do. Well, I think there was one day when she agreed to do it, and then she backed off of it immediately. The second problem of the European financial, I need to go back, central bank, it's really the financial system itself. While you have a common market and other things in the European Union, you do not have a common financial market. Greek bonds are issued by the Greek government, Italian bonds are issued by the Italian government, German bonds are issued by the German government. Therefore, there is no euro bond. There are just different governments borrowing in euros. A solution to this problem is to unify the market. You would unify the market by saying all bonds are the same. Or if you wanted to really make it formal, just reissue them with the same face value, €1,000 bond, and so it will be reissued without the Bank of Greece on it. In the European Central Bank. Okay. Or not the Greek government, not the Bank of Greece. The national banks cannot bond. Okay, so that, of course, creates the problem that the German public is worried about, and I say obsessed with, thanks to the propaganda from German politicians. That is, if we, the Germans, if there's a Eurobond, that will mean that we, the Germans, are guaranteeing the borrowing of all of these irresponsible, lazy, feckless countries all over Europe. Well, there is definitely a problem here. This occurs in any federal system. It occurs in the United States. I'm not familiar with other federal systems such as Canada and Australia, but you have the problem that the central government must somehow limit the extent to which the components of the federation can borrow. And that's what a European fiscal authority would do. So when people say you can't have monetary union without fiscal union, what they mean is that you couldn't have a unified European financial system without some mechanism to police it. The current mechanism for policing it is a European Commission. And it has ineffective tools to do that, such as the Maastricht criteria, deficit criteria. But the problem is more basic than that. The European Commission is not democratic. It is an administrative body. It has no, democratic or representational legitimacy. I mean, it seems to me that people in Greece or Germany or anywhere in the European Union, if the new Italian government comes along and says, we have to make these cuts, we have to make these changes, and they're being overseen by the European Union under the direction of the Germans and the French and so on, be sure we did. Someone could legitimately say, I never voted for anybody in the European Commission. Why is it performing this very serious task that ought to be formed by a representative body, or at least one which is tightly regulated by legislative body. Because the European Parliament, in fact, its relationship to the European Commission is very loose. Okay, so that's the second problem. And the third problem, the fiscal authority. Lack of accountability, and the fourth problem. Okay, what will be the result of this? The Greeks will exit the euro. I think that's it's not 100%, but if someone came up to you and said, I will offer you 10 to 1, 10 lira for every one you bet, and you can have one of two choices. A year from now, Greece will be using the euro. A year from now, Greece will not be using the euro. Well, if I were offered that bet, I would take a year from now, Greece will not be using the euro. It is the current bailout package. It has already come unraveled. There will have to be another one. How it would be designed without making the changes that Chancellor Merkel says she will not do. Lender of last resort, euro bonds. She's for some kind of fiscal authority, which is, I guess, a good thing. So I'm not sure exactly how democratic she wanted to be. But that is not going to solve the short-term crisis. The short-term crisis is a crisis of the Greeks paying their debts. And that has to be solved within a stroke. There was an article in the Financial Times yesterday that said it has to be solved within the next few days. The Greek government would declare bankruptcy. The way to solve that is combination of Eurobond and the European Central Bank then acting as lender of last resort. Okay, that's what you do in the short run. I don't see that happening. It could happen within a year, but it won't happen soon enough for the Greeks. That would cause the financial crisis to go global. It will have a very big impact on financial institutions in Britain. There will be another banking crisis in Britain. Britain is not the world's biggest country, but it does have this huge financial center, which I don't know if you know, is the world's largest center of money laundering, illegal money laundering. That's, you might say, what it does in addition to speculating on securities. Again, the British banks will have to be bailed out, as will the German and the French. The impact on the United States is not so clear because while there is some exposure of U.S. banks, I've been unable to find any statistics that systematically compare to the exposure in Britain and the European countries. And that will result in a decade of European and U.S. stagnation. I mean, we're talking about like the 1930s, with major countries staggering along with 10% unemployment, unless you're in Spain where it will be 25% unemployment. And the social welfare cuts, very unlikely that there's going to be any government that will bring about a fiscal stimulus, because that's ruled out in Spain, where you're going to have at least 5 years of a right-wing government. In Britain, you're going to have at least 4 more years of a right-wing government. In Italy, this technocratic government is committed to cut, so it appears that there's no country, with one exception I'll come back to, that might go for fiscal expansion. And on the world scale, I think You can imagine the Chinese, or I can imagine the Chinese leaders sitting around. On the one hand, they're a bit distraught because Europe is a big market for them, and this is where they're talking about mercantilist policy. That's serious mercantilism. That's where they're dumping all their goods. On the other hand, their ambition is to be the most powerful country in the world, and then they discover that they're going to get there sooner than they thought because all the rest are giving up. That the U.S. is not going to challenge them seriously because it can't get its fiscal house together. Germany is forcing a depression upon the European Union, and so we'll see the rise of Chinese economic and political power. And I'll just finish up by summarizing. So there's a big problem in Europe. It's basically a German problem. That's not to say no one else has. Other governments need to make changes, but no other government can solve it. Germany has the only government that can solve it. The bright aspect of this, if there is anything optimistic, it is that the Christian Democrats are in a very weak political position in Germany. There will be an election, and if they lose, it's possible that the Social Democratic Party will take a more enlightened position on Europe and will institute a fiscal expansion that will very much depend on who leads the party and the balance within the party. Okay, thank you.
We would like to thank Professor Weeks for this enlightening talk. He took on this comments that are extremely banal in terms of laziness and explaining what's happening in the social life. Explaining these in terms of banality has been laziness. It's been very, very good. Thank you very much for this. And also the other banality in the comments on European crisis and global crisis is that this is a financial crisis evolving through the banking system, and when studying this as a separate, partial, one market kind of crisis, that you've grounded that on the real economy, talking about the wage differences in Germany and other parts of the European Union. So there are two takes on banality, one on this comments, and the other one is the separating, chopping up economy into different markets, kind of, and seeing it in totality. Thank you very much for all of this. Now we have some time for questions. Dennis, my panel, please.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. There are lots of points that I don't exactly agree, but I would ask you the question that you raised in the beginning of the lecture, which is how will the UK recover from this? I mean, how would you rate the UK recovery plan, since it's one of those countries that are not run by a technocratic government per se? What do you see for Cameron's recovery plan?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I could go over it. I would say that there are three proposals for proposals being debated. One is the government, which says lowering the deficit will increase private sector confidence, and that will lead to an increase in investment and exports, and that will lead to recovery. Now, if you place that in sort of an analytical context, it doesn't fit together, because the standard argument is government borrowing competes with the private sector for funds, and that pushes up interest rates, and pushing up interest rates lowers private investment. UK interest rates are currently below 0.5%. And in fact, they're falling. They're falling. The crises in Italy and Greece fall further. So it's hard to see how the reduction, by what mechanism the reduction in deficit would stimulate the economy. Some people make a Ricardian equivalence argument, but I don't think anyone really takes that very seriously. The second position, which is most consistent with the government's position, is that put forward by the biographer of Keynes, Robert Skidowski. He held a seminar about 3 weeks ago that he invited me to, and my co-authors, because we had written a paper on an idea similar to his. His proposal is the creation of a UK public investment bank, and this public investment bank would it should have no problem raising funds, because well in our proposal, by the way, there's a link in my website to this proposal. In our proposal, that you would take the Royal Bank of Scotland, which the British government owns more than half of. It has tremendous excess liquidity, and that would be used for rail projects and roads and things such as this, and maybe even getting the it might even be under the more right-wing view theory, private sector owned, and then have user charges. So that's a hope that through some investment bank you would obtain the fiscal expansion. It would be, let's say, a proxy fiscal expansion. I think that is unlikely to be on scale to be successful. Okay, so therefore what I propose is something complementary to that, and namely that the UK government should increase its borrowing by amount equal to 2% of GNP. I'll explain it in a moment why I choose 2% of GNP. So that would immediately take the deficit from about 10% of GNP to about 12% of GNP. Then this would be used as a direct fiscal expansion. I don't want to be too long, so I can go into the details of where it would be spent. So it would be spent immediately. All the statistics show that a rise in GNP leads to a rise in tax revenue, and actually a decline in expenditure. A decline in expenditures on unemployment compensation, on various types of household benefits, and so on. According to the calculations that I've done, within a year, you would have, from that 12%, you would be back down to 10%, and by the end of this Parliament, you would be down to 4% of GNP, if the economy grew at 2%, which is fairly modest rate of growth. And it turned out that the multipliers are such that a 2% borrowing at this moment leads to a 2% rate of growth. So that's my proposal. If you go faster than that, obviously the deficit would be totally eliminated. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the talk. And I would like to ask, how do you place Turkey in this context as a rising economic and political power in the region? Considering also its dependency on European exports and.
I was talking to one of your colleagues this morning about about that. And I think I've done a little bit of review of the Turkey situation before I came. Sadat was kind enough back in the summer to give me a paper in English on the Turkish economy. I apologize that I can't read Turkish. I hope we will do a little bit as soon as I'm attempting to make a little progress. Last summer I was interviewed for a Turkish newspaper, and I said that I was very optimistic. I thought that Turkey would avoid the European downturn, the robust export growth, and that its current account deficit was primarily foreign investment and would be closed fairly rapidly. I'm no longer optimistic about that, because since then, of course, you've had the euro situation get much, much worse. I didn't think that there would actually be a recession in the eurozone. I mean, last summer I didn't think that was going to happen. I just thought it was a slow growth. I thought Germany would continue to grow at like 2% or so. Now I think that Turkey's export growth is likely to decline. How much, I don't know. If its export growth rate declines and output continues to grow at a certain level, at the current level of about 6-7%, that will be completely unsustainable position, because the current account will become so large that debt will be accumulating faster than the economy is growing. So I would think now that the government must come up with some way of reducing the current account imbalance, if it is, and that may be to reduce the rate of growth. Fortunately, it's growing very rapidly, so there is some leeway, but I'm not at the moment. It depends on what instruments they use to reduce that current account deficit.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for this very nice comprehensive talk. At the beginning of the crisis, but not very lately maybe, some people also suggested Germany leaving the Eurozone actually. What do you think about that?
Yes,
rather than always talking about the periphery and the peaks.
Over the summer, I think it was about June, somebody wrote a semi-satirical article in the Financial Times that the solution was for Germany to leave the Euro. Well, there's some truth to that, isn't there? I mean, but it points out a bigger problem. If you have a currency union with one dominant country, in effect, the monetary policy becomes the monetary policy which is desired by that country. Which is serious if everybody's at the same level of development. But if they're at very different levels of development, then it becomes an insurmountable problem. There are many people that pointed this out. I should say, Krugman, right? That I didn't think it was sufficient seriousness because at that time Krugman was totally against the formation of the euro, and I thought it was. I know him slightly. I thought it was motivated for sort of American nationalist reasons. I think there's a little of that, but that was unfair. He said that if you have very different levels of development, it's unsustainable unless you're prepared to put up with a free migration from the depressed areas. That's what happened in the United States. You had very different levels of development, and then you get 1930s, and you had areas of the United States which just became depopulated. Right? West Virginia, maybe some of you have seen the American film Grapes of Wrath, a very famous film in the 1930s about the Great Depression, farmers losing their land and going to California. that was largest internal migration in the history of the United States. 1.5 million people moving from the central United States to mostly California and to other places too. But of course you can't do that in the Eurozone. There are language barriers that prevent it. And if it were to occur, well, we're seeing you get a little bit of it, and you get very xenophobic reactions to it. So it's not an intractable problem, but it was the management of it was through the European Adjustment Fund. You know, where the richer countries subsidize the poorer ones, but that has now dwindled away and is no longer being used for that purpose. So I think it's a very unstable. I think that the Eurozone will certainly break up. I think there's no question about that. The European Union will not, but without, if you aren't in the Euro, in a sense, you're just in a free trade zone. And so there's no reason for that to break up. There's one case. If the Greeks pull out, some of the France and Germany are so influential, might be sufficiently vindictive to say, okay, you reneged on your debts, you cannot have trade credits from the European Union. If they did that, Greece might as well just pull out. Yes.
I have a question that actually specifically for you, and it's a room full of economists, so I know I can answer. You said that one of the ways when this Greek problems emerged, one of the ways to respond was monetization of debt by the European Central Bank. I'm wondering why are economists so much against this monetization of debt? Why is this never on the agenda? Because when we don't do this, then governments pay very high rates of interest, and then they need to be covered by taxes. So why is this so much out of the agenda?
First, I should say, you should not feel intimidated because we're a bunch of economists. I think that most of what mainstream economics teaches is rubbish, but they've been very successful in convincing people that they know how the world works. And there's, I think, convincing people of what might be called the general law of economic ignorance, that most people are ignorant, and so that's why an intelligent person like my daughter, who is a substantial official in the United Nations, will begin sentences with me by saying, well, I'm not an economist. If someone said to you, what do you think Turkey should improve its national health system? Would you answer to that? Well, I'm not a doctor, I can't really comment. But people say that about economics all the time. But answer your question, and other people answer it too. It's true. The mainstream of the profession has an obsession about monetization. They consider it to be a perversion. This is quite a irrational consideration. And I would say that I won't bore you by going and explaining why monetization is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a beneficial thing in many cases. But you're certainly right. There's an obsession about it. Particularly the Germans are obsessed about it. Even though the British government and the American government have been engaged in monetization on a massive scale for the last several years. But you don't hear the IMF saying, we're going to bring sanctions against the United States and the British because they're monetizing the deficit. Yes?
So is this something we should, is this some conclusion we should draw from your presentation? That Europe has never been an optimum currency area.
Yeah, I think that's true. That doesn't mean it was impossible. But it does mean that I don't think there are extreme positions. For example, a very good British journalist, Larry Elliott, who writes for The Guardian, takes the position that it was a bad idea from the beginning. It was, completely in the wrong way, and they just have to ditch it all and start over. He gave a talk at a Guardian forum that I went to about a month ago, and that was basically the position that we just have to tear up the European project and start over. I don't agree with that, but what I do think is true is that it was done in the reverse order, in a sense. Not exactly reverse order, but in the wrong order. Because you had a group of countries with quite strong sovereign powers, and you basically eliminated one of their, well, more than one, both the monetary and exchange rate policy, one stroke. And then you left basically each country with only one macro instrument, fiscal policy. And even that was constrained by other rules, not as strictly as taking away the currency. So in that context, yes, it was not an optimal currency union. But if there had been, firstly, tax harmonization and a longer period of the adjustment fund, it might have been not quite viable. So I'm not saying it was never viable, but it wasn't viable under those circumstances.